This has been the great test of all the great civilizations throughout history, is that when the time came, the average citizen said, I will sacrifice myself for the country.
And these kids didn't want to be there. You know, 17, 18, 19 years old, they wanted to be shooting 22s at rabbits, not M1s at other young men. They wanted to be throwing softballs, not hand grenades. But there was an evil force loose in the world, and it fell to them to have to deal with it, because when the challenge came, that the society said to them, you got to go out there and fight. And they did.
30 seconds! God be with you! Get the hand out of your weapon. Keep those actions clear. We'll see you on the beach. Move your men off the beach! Down!
Saving Private Ryan, a film by Steven Spielberg. Starring two-time Academy Award winner Tom Hanks as Captain John Miller.
Clear the shingle!
Is the story of heroism and sacrifice, set in France during the D-Day invasion of World War II, where 8 soldiers risked their lives on a perilous mission to save one man.
Some private in the 101st lost 3 of his brothers, and he's got a ticket home.
I don't know anything about Ryan. I don't care. I'm gonna find him so he can go home. If that earns me the right to get back to my wife, well then, that's my mission. This is what it comes down to. This is what our orders are. Go find this one guy so he can go home while the rest of us stay here and fight the war. It's an obtuse concept, but there's no arguing with it. They just have to get it done.
The principal mission was to rescue someone for a good reason. And that attracted me to the story. That moved me.
Ryan! Anybody know Ryan? 101st Airborne? Ryan? You know a guy named Ryan? Private James Ryan from Iowa?
This ensemble cast includes Edward Burns, Tom Sizemore, Matt Damon, Giovanni Ribisi, Barry Pepper, Jeremy Davies, Adam Goldberg, and Vin Diesel.
You want to explain the math of this to me? I mean, where's the sense in risking the lives of the 8 of us to save one guy?
20 degrees. Anybody want to answer that?
This is about that great cadre of citizen soldiers, the guys who just joined, who enlisted because it was the right thing to do, who was really, their only job is to win the war so everybody can go home.
There's not a reason why, there's but to do and die.
They're ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, and they behave extraordinarily.
Nobody was prepared for how horrific it really was. And you really got a sense of what these guys had to go through.
Well, these guys do just what they're not supposed to do, which is care about one another. It's one of the tragedies of war, you know, that you lose your friends.
Fucking get out!
Regardless of what the words on paper were, and regardless how we worked out the story, this was going to be some brand of current, definitive document about a day of decision unlike any other, certainly in the history of the world.
Destroy Hitler's empire, smash it by air, break it wide open, then invade by sea. That was the directive.
D-Day was the pivot point of the 20th century. It was the day on which it was decided whether this world was going to be Nazi or was going to be democratic.
The night before D-Day probably was the most exciting night in our history. Those planes started taking off about 9 to 10 o'clock at night. They were coming over us at about 500 feet with their lights blinking. And then one of those planes was my brother, who was a young lieutenant in the 101st Airborne. And needless to say, I had a long prayer not only for him, but for the thousands of those guys who were within a half hour of being in combat.
I was getting scared. I was frightened to death. It was very quiet on the plane, and the first thing I pulled out was my rosary, and I kept saying these rosaries, one right after another. And someone next to me asked if he could borrow my rosary. And I said, no, I'm busy using it. I prayed all the way across until we hit the coastline. I used to tell people that one of the greatest lies on earth was when the jump master would say, "Are you ready?" And everybody said, "Yes." If you don't know what fear is, you'll be introduced to it rather quickly as you go out the door. And what I was thinking on the way down, I can't remember thinking of anything other than just this terrible fear. I don't think I was ever more afraid of anything in my life than at that moment.
The sizes of the forces involved were gargantuan. This was the biggest amphibious operation in all human history. Guys were thinking that this is going to be pretty easy. Maybe the Air Forces killed all those Germans with the pre-bombardment. Actually, they hadn't hit anything.
Most of the young men that landed on Utah and Omaha Beach had never landed on a beach before. This was their first time they'd ever fought in a war.
When those ramps went down on those Higgins boats with that very first wave, and those Germans who had been waiting and had been watching and they were holding their fire, thousands and thousands of them, rifles, machine guns, mortars, big cannon. I swear to God, in some of those boats, everybody got killed before anybody got out. It was just a wall of steel that hit them.
First of all, it was chaos. That's the only word that you can use to describe what the hell was going on. Why are we doing this? It said to myself, why am I doing this? You dig a hole and try to get below the firing squad and all that. And the closer you get to the ground, the longer you're going to live. That was my motto anyhow.
How afraid these young guys must have been. And they were so tired and soaking wet with all their wool and all their layers of clothing and all their gear and ammunition and weapons, that when they stepped off of those boats and seeing all of their pals dying around them, they were so exhausted and seasick, all they could do was crawl up those beaches.
But they kept coming and working their way across that beach and getting up to that seawall. The tendency was overwhelming. Every instinct in them said, get down as low as you can and just stay there. This is an unhealthy place. And this was a battle from which there was no retreat. There wasn't any way to go back. So you either stayed there and got killed, or you did something about it. What happened was that over here a captain, over here a second lieutenant, down there a sergeant, who had men around him, he didn't even know their names. The confusion was so great. He said, screw this. I ain't gonna get killed here. I'm going up that bluff and I'm gonna take some Germans with me. Now who's coming with me?
They had to cross that expanse of open beach with that blistering gunfire from all directions and to wade through it, and some of them survive and go on and achieve the monumental moment that D-Day was. It was a watershed that will be focused on in history forever.
It's not hard to imagine, you know, what it must have looked like. What it must have felt like, however, is something that guys like myself will never know. Never. Never in a million years.
I've kind of had an obsession with World War II. It originated with my father, who fought World War II in Burma and came back to tell all the stories to the family about what happened. He was in the Air Force, and he was the radio operator on board a B-25. I saw a lot of 16mm movies that my dad took when he was over there in India. So I grew up with these shots of my dad cleaning his .50 caliber machine gun, pictures of him on a bicycle. Everybody bicycled all through that region. And just stories about his buddies and all the great friends he made. I certainly think, you know, that my dad planted the seed in the sense that when he told war stories, you know, he wasn't trying to dissuade me from being interested in war. He didn't tell me horror stories about the war. He told me stories that made me want to know more about it.
He listened, and I think he absorbed it and sort of internalized it and put it into a system, because it comes out in the movies later about how he feels.
Television was right there in our world, and there were films like The Fighting Seabees and films like The Story of G.I. Joe and Back to Bataan and Sansa Iwo Jima. So between my father's stories and John Wayne's presence in these films, you know, as a youngster, I got the impression that, you know, war was something to be glorified, to be looked at with a kind of awe.
When he was a kid, he would take my movie camera and use it. He said, Dad, come on, let me take the pictures. You know, yours don't look so hot. You know, and we let him do it.
I was about 13, 14 years old, and I made a couple of war films. They were like little mini Hollywood films, filled with glory and storming the outpost and taking the hill. And, you know, it was all that macho gung-ho stuff that World War II movies kind of delivered to us.
They take a bunch of kids and they dye shirts dark and light so they could be the Nazis and the Americans, and they played desert warfare out in the desert in Phoenix. First he wanted to use real explosives, but I wouldn't go to the drugstore and buy gunpowder and make explosives, so we used this mud trick, and it worked pretty good. We take a stick and bury one end of the stick in the mud and pivot it on a stone. The kid that was acting as a soldier was supposed to get blown up, would run up to that thing, step on the other end of the stick, flip the mud in the air, which looked like an explosion, and fall on his face and contort and roll over and all kinds of stuff like that.
It was just making it up. We didn't have any special effects expertise. I didn't read any books. It was just, how do you make this come to life?
I'm in Escape to Nowhere, the guy driving the Jeep. Scrunched out so it looks real small.
Fighter Squadron was a movie I made around the same age I made Escape to Nowhere. It was in black and white. It was my first time I ever made a black and white movie, actually, and because I kind of had seen all the documentaries of World War II, and they were all in black and white in those days. And went out to the Sky Harbor Airport in Phoenix, and they had a whole bunch of old World War II airplanes and mothballs. You know, they had P-40s, they had Thunderbolts, they had F-6F Hellcats. They were all kind of lined up. My dad got permission to let us sit in the cockpit of a couple of these airplanes. My dad actually did all my costumes for me because I used the actual, you know, outfit that he brought back from Burma to make these movies with. So if I had 9 kids flying these airplanes, I actually only had one airplane. I only had one leather helmet with one set of goggles. They just kept trading them off. And in those days, when 8mm was all the rage, camera shops also sold documentaries from World War II. So I just intercut a 14-year-old kid in my dad's leather hat flying this airplane with actual gun camera footage from these documentaries you could buy at any camera store.
Steve would get up with a camera, and he'd have another kid in the cockpit, and when he wanted to show the plane banking, he would take the camera and just turn it like that, and then straighten it back up again. When you saw it on the screen, it looked like the plane went down like that, you know.
Sort of between reality and fantasy spliced this World War II Air Force story together.